Masechet Nedarim Daf Yud Chet. We're going to see a new Mishnah soon about ambiguous language or specific language. But first, we have one more question to Rav Huna. Rav Huna was commenting on the Mishnah that said, Yesh neder betoch neder, that one can make a neder and it will apply upon another neder. Rav Huna said that's only if there's some part of it that does not overlap. Like if you say, a neder, I'm a nazir today, and then you say I'll be a nazir tomorrow. So then there's one day that doesn't overlap. So therefore, the second one can apply, even though the first one is there. They'll apply successively. So we had a few questions on Rav Huna, and now we're going to have one more. Shmuel, on the other hand, said, no, even if I say I'm a nazir today, and then I said again I'm a nazir today, both of them will apply. So he disagrees with Rav Huna. We're going to prove for Shmuel against Rav Huna. Mativ Rav Hamnuna. Nazir lehazir. Mikancha nazirut chal al ha-nazirut. Okay, this is a braita. That is a midrash halacha. Quotes pasuk in Bemidbar. Nazir lehazir. That double language shows that that nazirut can apply upon nazirut. Someone's already a nazir, they can still take upon themselves a second nazirut obligation. Sheyachol. Now, why do I need a pasuk? Because v'halo dinhu ma shivua chamora en shivua chala al shivua nazirut kala lo kol sheken. Because otherwise, I would have made a kal vachomer and said, look, a din is a kal vachomer. A shivua, which is more stringent than neder. The Gemara in a second will explain in what way is shivua more stringent than neder, but we'll accept it for now. If a shivua, which is more stringent, and yet a second shivua cannot apply to a first shivua. If he says, I'm going to eat, then he says, again, I'm going to eat, or I'm not going to eat, then he says, again, I'm not going to eat, the second one does not apply. So, nazirut, which is more lenient, all the more so, the second one will not apply. So, if I didn't have a pasuk, I would follow this kal vachomer and assume that nazirut, which is a type of neder, the second one will not apply. Talmud Omar, Nazir lehazir, mekansha nazirut, chala al nazirut. So therefore, we need the pasuk to say, no, don't learn to kal vachomer from Shevuah regarding a neder, and especially a nazir. The second nazirut does apply to the first. All right, that's the end of the braita. Now, the braita doesn't say exactly what the case is, so we're going to analyze hechidameh. If it's talking about a case that the one that Rav Huna said, where he says, I am a nazir today, and then he says, I'm going to be a nazir starting tomorrow, do we need a pasuk? Of course that would apply. They are not completely overlapping, so you wouldn't need a special pasuk to apply to know that. Even in a parallel case of a shivua, if they're not entirely overlapping, the second one would apply. Ela lav da'amar hadeni nazir hayom, hadeni nazir hayom, vekatane nazirut chal al nazirut. Rather, it must be talking about a case where he says the same language, I'm a nazir today, I'm a nazir today, and that's why we need the pasuk to teach me that the second nazirut does apply to the first. So there you go. We have a baraita that proves from a pasuk that if you say the same thing twice and this totally overlaps, then it does apply. That is a challenge to Rav Huna, who said in such a case the second one would not apply. So how's Rav Huna going to answer? We can answer for him. La hacha b'maiskinan kegon shekibel alav shete nezirot bebat achat. Could be this baraita is talking about a case where he accepts upon himself two obligations of nezirut in one statement, not two statements after another. He says, I am going to be a nazir twice over. And in that case, he will have to be a nazir for 30 days, and he'll get double the punishment if he does something wrong, and he'll bring double the korbanot when he finishes, which is the same answer that we ended with on the previous stuff. For Rav Huna, we apply it here. That's what this baraita is coming to teach us, that a second nazirut can apply simultaneously if I said it in one statement. But if I said, Harei Nazir Hayom, period, and then I said, Harei Nazir Hayom, in that case, Rav Huna says, the baraita is not talking about such a case. In that case, it would not apply. All right, so he answered that question, and that's the final question. Now we're just going to go into that baraita and wonder, The Braita was assuming in the Kal Vachomer that a Shevuah is more stringent than a Neder. In what way? If it's because a Shevuah can apply even to something that has no substance, I can apply it to sleep or an action or anything that I do in action or non-action. I can make a shevuah, whereas a neder I cannot. A neder has to be on an object. This bread I will not eat. So in that way, it's more stringent. But on the other hand, there's a countermeasure. Neder nami chamor sheken hal al mitzvah kadeshut. As we saw, a neder also has a stringency in that it can apply to something that I'm commanded to do, just like it's something that is an optional action for me. I can make a neder that I'm not gonna that sukkah will be forbidden for me to sit in. That's a valid neder, even though it's not a valid shevuah to say I'm not going to sit in a sukkah. So each one has a stringency that the other one doesn't have, and they cancel each other out. So why the Braita say that a Shevuah is more stringent? Ela mishum dichti ba b'shvuah lo yenakeh. Because in the Ten Commandments it says regarding taking God's name in vain that lo yenakeh, God will not wipe out that person's sin, and so that's why a Shevuah is more stringent. A Shevuah is said using God's name or some reference to God's name. Whereas a neder, you just say ke korban, and so that's why a shevuah is more stringent than a neder. That was the basis of that Kal Vachomer. All right, so that concludes that section of the Mishnah, and now the next section says shevuah shelo ochal, ve'achal eno chayav ela achat. Regarding a shevuah, we saw a second shevuah does not apply to the first shevuah. I already created an obligation on myself. If I said I'm not going to eat, if I swear again and say I'm not going to eat, then the Mishnah says I do only have to bring one korban. If I did it by mistake, one korban. If I did it on purpose, one set of lashes. All right. Now the Gemara is going to discuss is what happened with the second shevuah. Does it not apply at all, or it does apply as a prohibition? Just that there's no punishment for it. Amar Rava im nishal al harishona sheniya hala alav. So we can test this out. Let's say a person does say Shevuah shelo ochal, period, and then he says Shevuah shelo ochal, and then he goes to the rabbi and he cancels out the first Shevuah. Right? He does hatara. And the first one goes away. So Rava says something surprising. The second one does apply. In other words, it was there the whole time, even though the Mishnah said that there's no punishment for the second one. He would only have to bring a korban for the first shevuah, but the second one is still hovering there. There is still a prohibition. Okay, that's what Rava said. Mimai, and we say, well, where does Rava know this from? He's inferring it from the language of the Mishnah. The Mishnah doesn't say that there is only one shevuah. Instead, v'katani eno chayav ela achat. It only says that he is not liable to two sacrifices, but rather only one. Ravcha dedetla kimitshal al chaberta hayla. So the problem only is that there is no span of time in which one applies and the other doesn't, because they completely overlap. He says, I'm not going to eat whatever he says, tomorrow. And the other one was also for the same span of time, I'm not going to eat tomorrow. So because there's no span of time in which one applies and the other, therefore the second one will not impose a further obligation of a sacrifice. But it is still there. It is still a hovering prohibition. So he would violate two prohibitions, even though there's only one punishment. So when he undoes the first, cancels out the first shevuah, then the second one does in fact take effect. All right, that's the explanation of Rava. All that was one version of Rava. Here Rava says his statement first, and then the Gemara asks, how does he know it from, and proves it from the Mishnah. Here's a Lishna Acharina, which just reverses the order and makes an inference first, and then Rava second. Chiyuvahu deleka ha-shevuah ika. Since the Mishnah said that he is liable to one, only one. So we can infer from this, a liability there is not for the second Shevuah, but the Shevuah does exist. It is there, hovering. Now, what difference would it make if I only have to bring one sacrifice? Then what's the difference if the second one is there hovering or not there hovering? Consequence will be the same, right? Well, here is a practical difference. Rava said if he would go and undo the first vow, then the second vow would apply instead of it, exactly the same as he said up here, just a different version. Okay, good. Now, lema mesayeh leh mi shenada shete nizirot umana et harishona v'frish korban v'nishal aleha alta lo sheniya barishona. Let's see if we can prove this point of Rava. All right, Rava is the one that just said if you cancel the first Shevuah, the second one will apply. So we can bring a Mishnah to prove that Rava is correct. This Mishnah we already mentioned on the previous daf. It's a Mishnah from Masechet Shavuot. And it says, someone who made a vow for two Nazir obligations, and he counted out the first one, so he finished the 30 days, and he separated a korban. Okay, and then he goes to the rabbi and he cancels his first neder, the first nazirut. In that case, the 30 days that he observed and the animal sacrifice that he set aside will count for the second one instead of the first, right? It's not like you don't say that, well, since the first obligation, he made two obligations, two nizidot, since he had in mind that this would be for the first one, and he canceled the first one, maybe there's nothing at all, and he has to start the second one, because he was going to have to start the second one afterwards anyway. No, we don't say that. The second one was still there, hovering over, just waiting to come upon the person. It's not like when he says the first, only the first applies, and then when he says the second is pushed off till 31 days from now. No, it's always hovering there. And so if you cancel the first, immediately the second one jumps in, and retroactively, he already fulfilled that obligation of the second one. So this seems to support Rava, because Rava said something similar, that if he has his two shivuot, even though he's only liable to one, if he cancels that one, then the second one will jump in instead. It's always there and hovering, waiting to come in. All right, so this seems to be a good proof. There is a problem. Rava was saying this about a shivuah, whereas that Mishnah was talking about a neder. Nizirut is a type of neder. So that's basically what the Gemara is going to answer. And says, Kegon shekibel alav shete nezirot bebat achat. This is the same answer we saw before. We used it for Rav Huna twice. And so we're going to apply it here to reject the proof for Rava. It's not a disproof against Rava, it's just that there's no proof. And the point is that this case could be talking about, as we did say it was, according to Rav Huna, a case where, not that he said, I'm going to be a Nazir, and then period, I'm going to be a Nazir, but rather, he said one statement, I'm going to be a Nazir twice. Because he said, I'm going to be a Nazir twice, actually, both of them apply simultaneously, right? Not one after the other. And so they do apply simultaneously, and in that case, actually, he has to bring two sets of korbanot. And so if, in that case, he would cancel one of them, and he would cancel the first one, so the second one, it's not like the second one now takes the place of the first. The second one was there, is in effect the entire time. And so therefore, there is no proof from here. This is a different case, because two Nedarim can apply even at the same time when he says this type of formula, whereas that would not work for a Shevuah. So therefore, we have no proof from that Mishnah. All right, and now we get to the next Mishnah. Setam nedarim lehachmir uferusham lehakel. A very important principle, that if one makes a neder, but the language is ambiguous, it's not clear if he's referring to a permitted item or comparing this bread or whatever to a prohibited item, or if the prohibited item is something prohibited by a vow or from the Torah, all that will make a difference. And so if we're not clear what it is, we're going to assume he meant for stringency. Because usually if a person is making a neder, this bread will be like X, probably he's not saying nonsense words. He's probably saying that because he wants to make himself prohibited. Otherwise, why would he say anything? However, that's only if he doesn't specify. If he does specify, and he specifies that this bread will be like something that, like pig, something that's already prohibited in the Torah, then it won't apply, because you can only transfer something that's prohibited by a vow to a vow. Or if he makes it comparable to something that's permitted, then the vow will not apply. So we don't say, well, if you made a vow, you must want to make a prohibition. You just said the language wrong. No, if he specifies something that's permitted, then it will be permitted. Okay, we'll see a few examples. Kesad. Amad hare alai kebasar maliach ki yayin nesech. That's all the person said. He left it stam, open-ended. This bread will be prohibited to me like salted meat. Now, salted meat could refer to kosher, salted meat, regular chulin that I can eat, or could refer to salted meat of a korban that I'm not allowed to eat before the blood is sprinkled. So this is ambiguous language. Yayin nesech. Yen nesech could be prohibited as part of a sacrifice, in which case it's prohibited by a vow, or it could be yayin nesech for avodah zarah, in which case it will be prohibited from the Torah, and you don't make a vow based on something that's prohibited from the Torah. So now, if he says, so first we're going to say, does he specify? Im b'shel shelamim nadar asur. If he said, this is like kebasar maliach of shelamim, or yayin nesech of shelamim, then that is prohibited by a vow, and that creates a vow on the bread. The vow would be prohibited. Im b'shel avodah zarah nadar mutar. But if he says it for avodah zarah, this is be like salted meat for avodah zarah, or like yayin nesech for avodah zarah. In that case, since the original prohibition is from the Torah, so you cannot use that as a basis for a vow, and therefore there is no vow, I can eat the bread. V'im stam, and if I didn't say anything, I just said like yayin nesech, like basar maliach, then it's prohibited. We assume his intention is to create a prohibition, because most people, if they're going to say something, this bread, is like whatever it is, sounds like he wants to make himself prohibited. He wants to stay away from carbs, whatever it is. Why would he say something that would have no effect? Unless he says specific outright something that has no effect, then has no effect. But if he says something ambiguous, we assume he wanted to make a prohibition upon himself. The next example, he says this bread will be like something consecrated to me. If he says specifically, this will be like a cherem to heaven, meaning to the Bet HaMikdash, then it's prohibited. A cherem, something that you have to donate to the Bet HaMikdash, that is a vow, and you make it prohibited upon yourself, so the bread will be prohibited. If he says explicitly, this will be a cherem to Kohanim, well then he doesn't actually mean to make it consecrated, he just wants to give it as a gift to a Kohen. This gift to a Kohen, while the monetarily, yes, going to belong to a Kohen, but it's not holy. It's not prohibited from anyone to eat from it. If the Kohen says, okay, come and share it with me, then anyone can come and eat it. So this is just a regular monetary gift. It's not a consecration. It's not prohibited. It's not prohibited to eat. It's not like it's not kosher. And so therefore, if he says specifically this bread will be like a gift to a Kohen, then the bread is permitted. Vim setam asur. If he didn't specify either way, we assume that he wanted to make himself a prohibition, and therefore we assume he meant this is like a cherem. We assume he meant for shamayim. The next example is a long Mishnah. Hare alai kema aser. Im kema aser behema nadar asur. Im shel goren mutar. Vim setam asur. He says this bread is going to be like the tithe. Well, if he specified, and he said it's going to be like a tenth of the animals. When you have a lot of animals, newborns, so you pass them all through under a gate, and every 10th one is going to be is consecrated. If it's kosher animal without blemish, then it actually will be sacrificed. So that would be prohibited as a vow, and it's consecrated, so then that makes a legitimate vow. But if it's from the granary, you have to give maaser also to the Levi from the granary. Well, that is permitted because the tenth of the grain that one gives to a Kohen is not forbidden to eat. It belongs to the Kohen monetarily. It's a gift, to the Levi. It's a gift to the Levi, but if the Levi says, come and share it, that's okay. And even nowadays, we actually, in Israel, people will separate the Ma'aser, because you do have to separate it, but then we say, well, if the Levi really wants it, let him come and prove that he's actually a Levi. Because nobody can be sure of their lineage today, so if he proves it, then he can take it. If not, I'm just going to eat it, right? Unlike terumah. Terumah is holy, and a non-Kohen is not allowed to eat terumah, but Ma'aser does not become Kodesh, and therefore, if you say this is like Ma'aser of a Levi, I'm going to give to a Levi of grain, that's permitted, there's no prohibition on it. Vim setam asur, if he doesn't say anything, it's like Ma'aser. We assume his intention was to make a prohibition, so we assume he meant it's like Ma'asar behema. Next example. Hare alai kitruma. This bread will be upon me, prohibited, like he said, it'll be upon me like teruma. Im kitruma talishka nadar asur. There's different kinds of teruma. One is machasita shekel, that you gift to the temple treasury. Lishka is the treasury office. Then that's prohibited because machasita shekel is a neder, right? You're taking upon yourself this obligation that this coin will go to machasita shekel. Vim shel goren mutar, but if it's of grain that I give to a kohen, well, that would be permitted because terumah is a deoraita prohibition. Torah already says that a non-kohen cannot eat terumah. So since it's already prohibited from the Torah, it's not prohibited as a vow. So then the bread would be permitted. Vim setam asur dibre Rabbi Meir. If you didn't say anything, just said harei like kitruma, we take the stringent interpretation that he must have meant like machasita shekel. Oh, this is the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda argues on a couple of points. Rabbi Yehuda Omer setam teruma bihuda asura bagalil muteret she'en anshe galil makirin et terumat halishka. So Rabbi Yehuda takes issue with the last point regarding the harei alai kitruma. If he just said harei kitruma without any specification, so I agree with Rabbi Meir in Yehuda, because in Yehuda they know what machasita shekel is. And so he might mean this, he might mean machasita shekel, he might mean teruma of the grain. We're not sure, so we assume stringency. But in the Galilee, they were farther away from the Bet HaMikdash. And he's probably talking about a time after the Bet HaMikdash is destroyed. And so after the Bet HaMikdash is destroyed, people are not talking about machasita shekel. And when people say teruma, in the Galil, they are not thinking about teruma talishka. That's not what they have in mind, because they don't even know about it. And makirin, they're not familiar with teruma talishka. If they're not familiar with it, when they say harei alai kitruma, we can assume they mean teruma of grain, and that is permitted. And so therefore, if someone says ambiguous language, the short language in Galil, it's permitted. And this is very interesting. It goes by place, right? What's the common? How are these words used in this place? And if it's not ambiguous in the Galil, because everybody means just of the grain, then that's permitted. We now have a second case that disagrees with Rabbi Meir. It says, Stam haramim bihuda mutarim bagalil asurin she'en anshe galil makirin et charmeh hakohanim. According to Rabbi Meir, if someone said this bread will be cherem, if he meant and said cherem to shamayim, then it's prohibited. If he said cherem to a kohen, then it's just a regular gift to a kohen, is permitted. So if he doesn't say anything, according to Rabbi Meir, we assume he meant la shamayim. But this statement here says no. In Yehuda, even if he didn't specify, we assume it's permitted, because in Yehuda there's lots of kohanim around, and people, if they make a cherem, this again may be talking about after the Bet HaMikdash is destroyed. So what's the point of making a cherem to shamayim if there is no Bet HaMikdash to give it to? So they ask someone, what does cherem mean? Oh, cherem means something I give to my friend, the kohen. So therefore, even ambiguous language, just stam cherem, means to give it to a friend, the kohen, and therefore that does not create a prohibition. Whereas in the Galil, that's where sometimes people use cherem this way, sometimes people use it that way. Actually, according to this, the people in Galil are not familiar with the cherem kohanim. They don't usually do that. They don't give cheremim to a kohen. And that's why in the Galil, since they're not familiar with that term, a cherem to a kohen, if you say cherem in the Galil, everyone assumes that it's talking about a cherem l'shamayim. So in Yehuda, stam cherem is going to be to a kohen and therefore permitted. In the Galil, everybody thinks cherem means to not to a kohen, to the Bet HaMikdash, and therefore it's prohibited according to this view. Okay, now one question here we have against the Mishnah. V'hatenan safek nizirut lakel. There's a Mishnah in Taharot that says if someone takes upon himself a nazir obligation, but in an ambiguous language, he makes some kind of condition. He says if there's this much grain in this pile, then I'm a nazir, and then the grain blows away. You can't go and figure out, was I a nazir? Was I not a nazir? Or any kind of uncertain language, we assume leniently because if a person really wants to make himself a nazir, so he has to be sure about it. And so if there's any unsurety, then he must have not meant it, and he does not want to be a nazir. So now we have a contradiction, because in this Mishnah, in Nedarim, it says that if he makes himself if we're not uses ambiguous language, we assume stringently, and this is a type of neder, so he will be a nazir. But in that Mishnah, we assume that he is not a nazir. So we're going to present an answer. Amar Rabbi Zera, la kashya, ha Rabbi Eliezer, ha Rabbanan. Most manuscripts have Rabbi Elazar here, so we'll go with them. So we say this is not a problem. The Mishnah over there in Taharot is talking about is the opinion of Rabbi Elazar. Our Mishnah here is the opinion of Rabbanan, and they disagree about things that are in doubt. How do we know that they disagree about it? From the following baraita, which regarding a koi. A koi is a type of animal that we don't know how to classify it. Is it a domesticated animal, a behemah, or a wild animal, a chaya? It's something in between. Some say it's a water buffalo or a muflan. Okay, whatever it is, the rabbis didn't know how to categorize it, or is it a different species on its own? So here's the case. Hamakdish hayato ubhemto. Higdish etakoi. If someone made holy his wild animals, or he consecrates his domesticated animals. According to Tanakama, the koi is included in that, even though you're uncertain, is it this or that? So we assume for stringency that the koi is either one or is the other, is included in one of them. Whereas it'd be Elazar Omer, lo hikdish et hakoi. He says, no, it's not consecrated because we're not sure what category it fits into. So, if he said, this is going to be makdish, my domesticated animal, well, I'm not sure that this is part of that. Undomesticated animal, we're not sure it's part of that. And so if we have uncertainty, then we go to leniency. So here's how we'll match it up. The one who follows the stringency, that would be the Tanakama here, the rabbis. And since regarding money, he's consecrating this animal, so he's donating the worth of the animal to the Bet HaMikdash. So if regarding money we assume a doubt that a doubt is going to be for stringency, then also for the person himself, if he says I'm going to be a nazir, we're going to assume stringency. So that's the Rabbanan, and that's the author of our Mishnah in Nedarim. Whereas Rabbi Elazar, who says regarding money that we do not make it, don't give it over when we're in doubt, we assume for leniency. So then he would say the same thing regarding a person's body when he says I'm going to be a nazir, an obligation upon himself. Also, he will assume stringency. So Rabbi Elazar is the author of the Mishnah in Taharot, right? If he's going to be lenient regarding money, all the more so he's going to be lenient regarding a nazir. Okay, so this is the answer. On the next stuff, we're going to present some challenges to the response of Rabbi Zera. Baruch Adonai L'olam. Amen ve'amen.